He thought he had seen every kind of fear money could buy, until a little girl ran through the rain and shattered the silence of his world. The black SUVs rolled slowly beneath the glowing hotel lights in downtown Seoul, their polished surfaces reflecting streaks of cold rain across the empty midnight street. Men in dark suits stepped out first, scanning every corner with disciplined eyes while guests near the entrance lowered their voices the moment Seo Ji-hoon appeared. At 38 years old, the Korean Mafia Boss carried the kind of presence that made entire rooms straighten their posture without being asked. His charcoal overcoat moved slightly in the wind as he climbed the marble steps toward the hotel, his expression unreadable beneath the city lights. Nobody spoke directly to him unless necessary. Nobody touched him. Nobody interrupted him. And then suddenly, someone did. A small figure burst through the line of security guards like a terrified deer escaping traffic. Tiny sneakers splashed through puddles as a little girl, no older than 7, crashed into Ji-hoon's legs with enough force to stop him mid-step. The guards reacted instantly, reaching for her shoulders, but the sound that came out of the child froze every movement around them. "Please," she cried, her voice trembling so hard it barely sounded human anymore. "She's not my mom." The rain poured harder against the pavement. Ji-hoon looked down slowly. The little girl's hands clung tightly to his coat, as if letting go would destroy her. Her white socks were stained gray from the wet streets, and one knee of her school uniform had been torn open from falling. But what caught his attention was not the rain or the shaking. It was the fear in her eyes. Real fear. The kind adults spend entire lives trying to hide. Behind the child, high heels clicked sharply against the marble entrance. A beautiful woman approached under a black umbrella, perfectly dressed in cream-colored designer clothing, her makeup untouched by the storm. Han Soo-jin bowed politely to Ji-hoon, her smile smooth enough to fool almost anyone watching. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "My daughter has been very emotional lately." The girl immediately buried her face deeper against Ji-hoon's coat. "No," she whispered desperately. "Please don't let her take me." Several hotel guests exchanged uncomfortable glances before quickly looking away. Nobody wanted involvement in family problems, especially not near a man like Seo Ji-hoon. But someone else had noticed. Near the hotel entrance stood Grace Coleman, an older black housekeeper wearing simple gray cleaning clothes and holding a cart of folded towels. She had spent decades quietly watching wealthy people hide ugly truths behind beautiful smiles. And the moment she saw the little girl trembling at the sound of that woman's voice, something inside her turned cold. Ji-hoon remained motionless. Rainwater dripped slowly from the edge of his coat, while the child continued shaking against him. Soo-jin laughed nervously. Children say dramatic things when they're upset. But the girl suddenly lifted her head, tears streaming down her face. "She told me nobody would believe me." Silence swallowed the front entrance. Even the rain somehow sounded quieter. One of Ji-hoon's guards stepped closer, waiting for instructions, but the mafia boss still said nothing. His eyes moved once toward the faint bruising near the child's wrist before returning to Soo-jin's perfectly composed face. And for the first time that night, the woman's smile flickered. Han Soo-jin recovered quickly, but Grace Coleman noticed the change before anyone else did. It lasted less than a second. A tiny crack behind the woman's polished smile. The kind that only appeared when control started slipping away. The hotel lobby had gone unnaturally quiet as rainwater dripped from the marble steps outside, and little Yoon-hoon still refused to let go of Seo Ji-hoon's coat. The child's fingers trembled so badly that even the buttons of his overcoat shook slightly with every breath she took. Ji-hoon lowered his eyes toward her again, his face unreadable, but his body had not moved once to push her away. That alone unsettled everyone around him. "Hoon," Soo-jin said softly, taking one careful step closer. "You are embarrassing yourself." The little girl immediately stiffened. Grace saw it clearly from across the entrance hall. Fear did not always scream. Sometimes it became silence. Sometimes it became a child forgetting how to breathe. The older black housekeeper slowly tightened her grip around the towels in her cart while watching the scene unfold beneath the golden chandelier light. She had worked inside luxury hotels long enough to recognize the difference between discipline and terror. And this child was terrified. Soo-jin gave another graceful bow toward Ji-hoon. "I apologize for the disturbance." My daughter has been under emotional stress since her father passed away. Ji-hoon finally spoke, his voice low and calm enough to make the room feel colder. How long ago? Soo-jin blinked once, surprised by the question. About 8 months. And she still reacts like this? The woman hesitated for half a heartbeat before smiling again. Children process grief differently. Haeun suddenly shook her head against Ji-hoon's chest. That is not true, she whispered. Soo-jin's eyes sharpened instantly. It happened so fast most people would have missed it. But Grace did not. Neither did Ji-hoon. The mafia boss slowly removed one black leather glove while studying the child's expression. Years of surviving dangerous men had taught him one thing better than anyone else in the city. Fear could not be rehearsed forever. Eventually the truth leaked through the cracks. Look at me, he told Haeun quietly. The little girl hesitated before lifting her tearful eyes toward him. Why did you run to me? Several guards exchanged nervous glances. Nobody asked Seo Ji-hoon questions, and he almost never asked them himself. Haeun swallowed hard. Because everybody listens to you. The answer landed heavily inside the silent lobby. Even Soo-jin's smile faded for a moment. Outside, thunder rolled through the city skyline while headlights reflected across the wet streets below. Grace could not explain why, but something about the child's voice made her chest ache. It was the sound of someone who had already learned disappointment too young. Soo-jin stepped forward carefully again, extending her hand toward the little girl. Come here, sweetheart. Let us go home. Haeun immediately buried herself deeper against Ji-hoon's side. Please no. The words were barely audible, but in the silence, everyone heard them. Ji-hoon turned his head slightly toward one of his men. Bring the car around. Soo-jin finally relaxed, believing the situation was ending. Then Ji-hoon spoke again without looking at her. The child rides with us tonight. The entire lobby froze. Grace felt her breath catch in her throat as Soo-jin's perfect expression disappeared completely for the first time. And beneath the warm hotel lights, Seo Ji-hoon noticed something that made his instincts sharpen even further. The woman looked afraid. The ride across Seoul felt longer than usual that night. Rain slid slowly across the tinted windows of Seo Ji-hoon's black SUV while the city lights stretched into blurred rivers of gold and white outside. Inside the vehicle, nobody spoke. Yoon-hoon sat perfectly still beside him, clutching the sleeves of an oversized gray blanket one of the guards had quietly handed her before they left the hotel. Her tiny wet sneakers rested carefully near the floor mat, as if she was afraid to touch anything expensive. Across from them, Han Soo-jin maintained her elegant posture, though the tension in her jaw had started to betray her calm expression. Every few seconds, her eyes drifted toward the child before quickly returning to the window. Grace Coleman sat in the front passenger seat beside the driver, silent as she watched everything through the reflection in the glass. She noticed how Haeun flinched whenever Soo-jin adjusted her bracelet. She noticed how the little girl stopped breathing for a second whenever the woman leaned even slightly closer. But what disturbed Grace most was something else entirely. The child did not react like someone seeking attention. She reacted like someone trying to survive the next minute. Ji-hoon finally broke the silence. How old are you? Haeun looked down at her hands before answering softly. 7. His eyes moved toward the faint bruising near her wrist again. Do you go to school? Sometimes. Soo-jin smiled quickly. She has been struggling emotionally since the family situation changed. Ji-hoon did not look at her. I asked the child. The air inside the vehicle instantly tightened. Haeun lowered her voice even further. I used to go every day. Used to. The word lingered heavily between them. Ji-hoon leaned back slightly against the leather seat, studying her with quiet attention. Most adults lied to him within the first 30 seconds of conversation. Children usually did not, especially frightened ones. The convoy eventually pulled beneath the private entrance of Ji-hoon's hillside estate overlooking the Han River. The mansion stood above the city like a dark fortress of glass and stone, its warm interior lights glowing against the storm outside. Guards opened the doors immediately, but before anyone could move, Haeun suddenly grabbed Ji-hoon's sleeve again. Panic flashed across her face. Please do not leave me alone with her. Nobody moved. Even the rain outside seemed distant now. Soo-jin let out a strained laugh. She is exhausted. She does not understand what she is saying. But Ji-hoon noticed something chilling. The little girl was not even looking at the woman anymore. She was staring directly at the floor near Soo-jin's shoes, like eye contact itself had become dangerous. Grace slowly turned around from the front seat and looked carefully at the child for the first time since they left the hotel. Her voice came out gentle and warm. "Sweetheart, when was the last time you ate?" Haun blinked as if the question itself surprised her. "Yesterday morning." Silence crashed through the vehicle. One of the guards lowered his eyes immediately. Ji-hoon's expression did not visibly change, but the atmosphere around him did. Cold became colder. Slow became still. He opened the door himself and stepped out into the rain before speaking quietly to Grace. "Prepare the guest room beside the East Library." Then his eyes shifted once towards Soo-jin. "And tonight, the child stays where she feels safe." The mansion became strangely quiet after midnight. Rain still tapped softly against the enormous windows overlooking the Han River, while warm amber lights glowed through the endless hallways of Seo Ji-hoon's estate. Most of the staff moved carefully whenever he was home, speaking in lowered voices and avoiding unnecessary footsteps. But tonight felt different. Tension drifted through the house like invisible smoke. Grace Coleman stood inside the guest bathroom beside the East Library, gently folding clean towels while steam rose from the hot shower nearby. Yoon-hoon had barely spoken since arriving at the mansion. The little girl ate half a bowl of soup in complete silence before quietly asking if she could lock the bedroom door. Grace had answered with the softest voice she could manage. "Nobody is going to hurt you here." But the child had not looked convinced. A few minutes later, the bathroom door slowly opened, and Haun stepped out wearing oversized cream-colored pajamas one of the housekeepers had found for her. Her wet hair rested against her cheeks, and for the first time since the hotel, she looked less like a frightened runaway and more like a child. Grace smiled gently. "Those pajamas are too big for you." Haun glanced down at the sleeves hanging past her hands. "They are warm." Something about the answer nearly broke Grace's heart. The older woman crouched carefully to help dry the child's hair with a towel, but as she lifted the damp fabric near Haun's shoulder, her hands suddenly stopped moving. Faint bruises covered the child's upper arm. Some older, some newer. Grace froze silently for several seconds while Haun lowered her eyes toward the floor. "Did she do this?" Grace asked quietly. The little girl did not answer right away. Instead, she looked toward the bedroom door as if checking whether someone might be listening. Then she whispered, "She gets angry when I cry." Grace felt something heavy settle in her chest. She had worked around wealthy families for most of her life. She had seen children ignored, manipulated, treated like decorations for expensive homes. But this felt colder than neglect. This felt like fear living permanently inside a 7-year-old child. Haun slowly climbed onto the edge of the bed while clutching the blanket tightly against herself. "If I disappear," she asked softly, "would anybody notice?" Grace stared at her in disbelief. Outside, thunder rolled faintly above the city skyline. The child's voice had not sounded dramatic or emotional. It sounded honest. That was what made it unbearable. Grace sat beside her carefully and wrapped an arm around the little girl's shoulders. "Listen to me," she said gently. "A child should never have to ask a question like that." Haun finally looked up at her, eyes glossy beneath the bedroom light. "My real father used to say that too." Grace's expression changed instantly. "Your real father?" The little girl nodded once. "He disappeared after he signed papers with her." Silence filled the room. Grace suddenly understood why Seo Ji-hoon's instincts had sharpened the moment he saw the child at the hotel. This was not a misunderstanding between a difficult child and a tired parent. Something far darker was hiding underneath the polished surface of Han Soo-jin's perfect life. And somewhere else inside the mansion, Seo Ji-hoon sat alone in his private office, staring at the rain beyond the glass, while replaying one sentence over and over inside his mind. "Please do not leave me alone with her." Morning arrived beneath a gray sky over Seoul, but the atmosphere inside Seo Ji-hoon's mansion remained heavy and still. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the enormous estate wrapped in cold silence, while servants moved carefully through the hallways carrying trays of coffee and breakfast. Nobody spoke loudly when Ji-hoon was awake. This morning, nobody spoke at all. Inside his private office overlooking the river, Ji-hoon sat behind a dark wooden desk, while files and photographs slowly spread across the surface in front of him. One of his most trusted men stood nearby waiting quietly. Everything connected to Han Soo-jin, Ji-hoon said without looking up. Family history, financial records, medical records, adoption paperwork. I want all of it. The man nodded once. Yes, sir. Ji-hoon's eyes settled on a photograph of Yoon-hoon taken at some charity event months earlier. The child in the picture smiled brightly beside Soo-jin for cameras and reporters. Perfect family. Perfect image. Perfect lie. He leaned back slowly in his chair while memories he had not touched in years surfaced without warning. He remembered being 8 years old and sitting silently at enormous dinner tables where nobody asked if he was afraid. In wealthy homes, pain was usually hidden behind polished manners and expensive clothes. That was why most people never noticed it. But Ji-hoon had built his entire empire by noticing things others ignored. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Grace Coleman stepped into the office holding a silver tray with untouched coffee. Her expression alone told him something had changed. The child is awake, she said quietly. But there is something you should know. Ji-hoon looked at her for several seconds before gesturing toward the chair across from him. Grace rarely involved herself in his affairs. If she came here personally, it mattered. She carefully explained what Hoon had revealed the night before. The bruises, the fear, the missing father. The child asking whether anyone would notice if she disappeared. By the time Grace finished speaking, the room had become unnaturally cold. Ji-hoon remained completely still, one hand resting against the edge of the desk. Did she say anything else? Grace hesitated. She said her father disappeared after signing papers with Soo-jin. Silence followed immediately. One of the guards near the door lowered his eyes toward the floor. Even he could feel the atmosphere shifting. Ji-hoon finally stood and walked toward the massive windows overlooking the city. Morning traffic moved far below like distant streams of light, unaware that somewhere above them, a powerful man had started connecting pieces together. Find the father, he said calmly. Alive or dead, I want answers. Yes, sir. Grace watched him carefully. Most people feared Seo Ji-hoon because of his power, but she had worked inside this mansion long enough to understand something others missed. The quieter he became, the more dangerous the situation truly was. A second knock came from outside the office door. One of the younger housekeepers stepped inside nervously. Sir, she said softly. The little girl refuses to eat unless Miss Grace sits beside her. Ji-hoon glanced toward Grace for a brief moment before looking away again. Then sit with her. The housekeeper hesitated. And Miss Soo-jin is asking when she may leave the estate. Ji-hoon's expression did not change. She does not leave. The room fell silent again. Somewhere down the hallway, Hoon's small laughter suddenly echoed for the first time since arriving at the mansion. It lasted only a few seconds, but everyone inside the office heard it. And somehow, that sound made Seo Ji-hoon even more certain that something inside this story was terribly wrong. By evening, the mansion no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It felt like a waiting room before something inevitable arrived. Warm lights glowed across the massive dining hall, while rain clouds still covered the skyline outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. A long black table stretched beneath crystal chandeliers, prepared with elegant dishes most people would only see in luxury magazines. But despite the expensive setting, nobody inside the room seemed comfortable. Seo Ji-hoon sat quietly at the head of the table, one hand resting beside an untouched glass of water, while several members of his inner circle joined the dinner in cautious silence. Han Soo-jin wore a soft ivory dress and smiled with practiced perfection, though faint exhaustion had begun showing beneath her makeup. Across from her sat Yoon-hoon, unusually small against the oversized leather dining chair. Grace Coleman remained nearby beside the serving table, pretending to arrange plates while carefully watching the little girl's face. Ji-hoon had organized this dinner for one reason only: observation. He wanted to see what fear looked like when nobody realized they were being tested. The food is excellent tonight, Soo-jin said gracefully, attempting normal conversation. Nobody answered immediately. The clink of silverware echoed softly through the room instead. Hoon barely touched her meal. Her shoulders remained tense beneath the pale blue sweater Grace had found for her earlier that afternoon. Every time Soo-jin spoke, the child's fingers tightened around the fork. Ji-hoon noticed all of it. He noticed the way Hoon avoided eye contact. He noticed how she quietly counted breaths under her breath whenever Soo-jin leaned closer. Most importantly, He noticed that the child only relaxed when Grace entered her line of sight. Grace finally placed a small dessert plate near Hoon with a gentle smile. "You should eat something sweet, sweetheart." The little girl gave a tiny nod. For the first time all evening, her body relaxed slightly. Then Soo-jin reached across the table. It looked harmless to everyone else. Just a woman touching a child's hand. But the second her fingers brushed Hoon's wrist, the little girl froze completely. The fork slipped from her hand and struck the porcelain plate with a sharp metallic sound that cut through the room like shattered glass. Hoon's breathing became uneven almost instantly. Her face drained of color as she pushed backward against the chair in panic. "No," she whispered weakly. "Please." Grace moved first. "It is all right," she said quickly while kneeling beside the child. But Hoon suddenly became sick from fear, coughing and trembling while tears filled her eyes. One of the men at the table slowly lowered his chopsticks in stunned silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the servants near the walls looked frozen beneath the chandelier light. Han Soo-jin's expression tightened immediately. "She is overreacting again," she said sharply before forcing another smile toward Ji-hoon. "She has emotional episodes sometimes." But Ji-hoon did not respond. He stared directly at Hoon while the child instinctively reached for Grace's hand like someone drowning. That single movement changed everything inside the room. Because children did not run towards safety by accident. And in that moment, Seo Ji-hoon realized something terrifying. The little girl was not afraid of being punished. She was afraid of being taken back. Slowly, almost silently, Ji-hoon placed his napkin beside his untouched plate and stood from the table. The sound of the chair moving against marble echoed through the enormous dining hall. Nobody dared breathe. His eyes finally lifted toward Han Soo-jin, calm enough to become frightening. And for the first time since arriving at the mansion, the woman looked genuinely nervous. The mansion did not sleep that night. Hallway lights remained dim, while security staff moved quietly between rooms, speaking in whispers that disappeared beneath the sound of distant thunder outside. After the dinner incident, Yoon-hoon had refused to leave Grace Coleman's side for even a moment. The little girl sat curled beneath a blanket inside the East Library, clutching a cup of warm tea with both hands while Grace softly read from an old children's book near the fireplace. Every few minutes, Hoon glanced nervously toward the door as if expecting someone to appear. Upstairs, Seo Ji-hoon stood inside his private office while 3 men from his security division waited silently around a conference table covered with files and photographs. One of them finally stepped forward holding a tablet. "We found something at Han Soo-jin's residence." Ji-hoon slowly lifted his eyes. "Explain." The man swallowed once before continuing. "There is a hidden room behind the piano wall on the 2nd floor. Our team only noticed it because the floor measurements did not match the architectural plans." The office became completely silent. Another man placed several photographs onto the table. Inside the hidden room were shelves filled with sealed documents, medication bottles, surveillance equipment, and stacks of financial records connected to inheritance transfers. But one photograph made the atmosphere inside the office turn ice cold. A child's bedroom chair positioned directly beneath a security camera mounted in the corner ceiling. Ji-hoon stared at the image without speaking. "There is more," the investigator added carefully. "We recovered an audio recording from a backup drive." He pressed play. Static crackled softly through the office speakers before Han Soo-jin's voice emerged clearly from the recording. "Calm. Controlled. Empty. Once the inheritance transfer clears, the child becomes unnecessary. Nobody will question it." Silence crashed into the room so heavily that even the guards near the walls stopped breathing for a moment. Ji-hoon's hand slowly tightened around the edge of the desk. The sound of leather gloves creasing beneath his grip was the only movement inside the office. One of the younger men lowered his gaze immediately. He had worked for Seo Ji-hoon for 6 years and had never seen his expression become this still. Not angry. Not loud. Worse. Controlled. "What about the father?" Ji-hoon finally asked. "We traced his financial records," the investigator replied. 3 months after signing guardianship papers, he vanished completely. No travel records. No bank activity. Nothing. Ji-hoon turned toward the rain-covered windows overlooking Seoul. Thousands of city lights flickered beneath the storm clouds while the audio recording continued echoing inside his mind. The child becomes unnecessary. Downstairs, Grace gently brushed Haun's hair back, while the little girl slowly drifted asleep beside the fireplace. For the first time in days, the child looked peaceful. Safe. Grace glanced toward the library entrance when she heard footsteps approaching. Ji-hoon entered quietly, still wearing the same dark suit from dinner. Haun stirred slightly at the sound, panic flashing across her face for half a second before recognizing him. Then something unexpected happened. The little girl reached toward him. Just a small movement, but enough. Ji-hoon stopped walking immediately. Grace watched silently as the most feared man in Seoul stood frozen beside a sleeping child who trusted him more after 2 days than she had trusted the adults around her for years. Slowly, Ji-hoon knelt beside the couch and pulled the blanket gently higher around Haun's shoulders. His voice came out lower than usual. She is never going back there. Grace looked at him carefully. What are you going to do? Ji-hoon's eyes remained on the child. The truth first. Then his expression hardened almost invisibly. Judgment after that. The storm finally cleared the following morning, but inside Seo Ji-hoon's mansion, the atmosphere remained colder than the rain ever was. Sunlight stretched across the marble floors in long pale lines while servants moved quietly through the estate, avoiding eye contact with everyone connected to Han Soo-jin. Word had spread without anyone speaking directly about it. Something terrible had been uncovered. And when powerful men became silent, intelligent people learned not to ask questions. Inside the main sitting room overlooking the garden courtyard, Soo-jin sat perfectly dressed in soft beige clothing, trying desperately to maintain composure while 2 guards stood near the doors behind her. Her hands rested calmly around a porcelain teacup, but the faint trembling in her fingers betrayed her. Across the room, Grace Coleman sat beside Yoon-hoon on a cream-colored sofa, gently brushing the little girl's hair while sunlight warmed the child's face for the first time in days. Haun looked smaller without fear controlling every movement. Exhausted, fragile, human. Then the doors opened. Seo Ji-hoon entered wearing a black suit and dark gloves, his expression unreadable as always. But something about him felt different now. Colder. Final. Nobody spoke while he crossed the room. He placed a thin folder onto the glass table in front of Soo-jin and sat down slowly across from her. Your hidden room was found, he said calmly. Soo-jin's face lost color immediately. I do not know what you are talking about. Ji-hoon slid several photographs across the table. Surveillance equipment, financial records, audio transcripts, inheritance documents. The woman stared at them in silence while the room seemed to grow smaller around her. You manipulated guardianship paperwork, Ji-hoon continued quietly. You isolated the child from school. You transferred assets connected to her father's estate. Soo-jin's breathing became uneven. You cannot prove anything illegal. Ji-hoon's eyes finally lifted toward her. Your own voice proved it for me. Silence crashed through the room again. Grace instinctively pulled Haun slightly closer beside her while the little girl lowered her eyes toward the floor. Soo-jin suddenly stood from the chair. That child is confused, she snapped. She lies because she misses her father. The moment the words left her mouth, Haun visibly flinched. Ji-hoon noticed instantly. Every person in the room noticed. And somehow, that tiny reaction felt louder than shouting. Ji-hoon slowly removed one glove and placed it beside the folder. Then, to everyone's shock, he stood and walked toward the little girl instead of towards Soo-jin. Haun looked up nervously as the powerful man stopped directly in front of her. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Seo Ji-hoon did something no one inside the mansion had ever seen before. He lowered himself onto one knee in front of the child. The guards near the wall froze completely. Grace stared at him in stunned silence. Even Soo-jin looked confused. Ji-hoon's voice came out low and steady. I should have listened to you sooner. Haun blinked rapidly, clearly not understanding what was happening. You were telling the truth from the beginning, he continued softly, and the adults around you failed to protect you. The child's eyes immediately filled with tears. Ji-hoon looked directly at her with a seriousness that silenced the entire room. That will never happen again. Nobody breathed. Nobody spoke. In a world where men fought to make others kneel before them, the most feared man in Seoul had chosen to kneel before a frightened little girl instead. And somehow, that moment carried more power than every threat he had ever made. 3 months later, the mansion overlooking the Han River no longer felt cold. Morning sunlight poured through the enormous windows while the sound of quiet laughter drifted softly through the hallways that once echoed only with silence and security reports. The storm that had arrived with Yoon Hoon that night in the rain felt far away now, almost unreal, like something trapped inside another lifetime. In the kitchen, Grace Coleman stood near the stove flipping pancakes while old jazz music played softly from a small speaker beside the coffee machine. The warm smell of butter and maple syrup filled the air as servants moved around the kitchen, smiling more than they used to. Ever since the little girl arrived, something inside the mansion had changed. People spoke softer. They lingered longer at breakfast. The house no longer felt like a fortress built for power. It felt lived in. Safe. Grace glanced toward the doorway when tiny footsteps suddenly raced across the marble floor. "Miss Grace," Hoon called excitedly, holding a drawing pad against her chest. The child looked healthier now. The dark circles beneath her eyes had faded, and fear no longer controlled every movement she made. She wore a pale yellow sweater with white socks, and her hair tied neatly back with a ribbon Grace had bought her at a small shop downtown. "Slow down, sweetheart," Grace laughed gently. "You are going to slide across this floor one day." Hoon grinned before climbing onto one of the kitchen stools. "I made something." Grace wiped her hands with a towel and leaned closer while the little girl proudly opened the sketchbook. Inside was a crayon drawing of the mansion garden beneath a bright blue sky. Grace stood smiling beside a flower bed, and near the center was Seo Ji-hoon wearing one of his long black coats. But unlike the cold man who had once stepped out of those black SUVs in the rain, this version held the hand of a little girl standing beside him. Above them, written in careful, uneven letters, were the words "My Home." Grace's eyes softened instantly. Before she could answer, another figure appeared quietly at the kitchen entrance. Seo Ji-hoon stood there holding a stack of business documents beneath one arm, his dark tie slightly loosened after an early morning meeting. For a man feared across Seoul, he suddenly looked strangely human standing beneath warm kitchen lights while watching a child wave crayons excitedly in the air. Hoon immediately jumped down from the stool and ran toward him without hesitation. Not fear, not panic, trust. Ji-hoon barely had time to lower the papers before the little girl wrapped her arms around his waist. For a second, he looked startled. Then slowly, almost carefully, his hand rested against the back of her head. Grace quietly turned away toward the stove, pretending not to notice the emotion crossing his face. "Did you sleep well?" Ji-hoon asked softly. Hoon nodded against his coat. "I did not have bad dreams." The room became still for a moment, because everyone there understood how important those words truly were. Ji-hoon looked down at the drawing still clutched in her small hand. "You drew this?" "Yes." "And who is that supposed to be?" Hoon smiled brightly. "That is my family." Silence settled gently across the kitchen while morning sunlight warmed the floor around them. Seo Ji-hoon stared at the drawing longer than necessary before finally kneeling slightly to meet the little girl's eyes. "You know," he said quietly, "I never planned to have someone waiting for me at breakfast." Hoon tilted her head. "Do you not like it?" For the first time in years, a genuine smile appeared on the mafia boss's face. Small, tired, real. "No," he answered softly. "I think I was just waiting for the right person." The child immediately hugged him again, while Grace stood silently near the stove, one hand covering her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Outside, sunlight shimmered across the river beyond the mansion windows while laughter echoed through rooms once ruled only by fear. And somewhere between the silence, the healing, and the warmth of an ordinary morning, even Seo Ji-hoon finally understood something money and power had never taught him before. Sometimes the people who save your life arrive carrying nothing except trust.